Hello everybody and welcome to a hopefully short guide video on the anniversary quests, specifically the 2025 version. A disclaimer, all the quests that we're going to talk about are very much subject to change, so I'd recommend that you take a look at any kind of release notes if you have to be looking at this in future anniversary quests, and be aware that the drop tables may change over time, but hopefully the run tags, gear tags, and difficulty will be more or less the same throughout, unless there's some kind of major rebalancing or addition of new quests. But with all that out of the way, let's go through a very short rundown of the quests available in the anniversary event. Now, I think the best way to kind of talk about them is to group them in by episode, and we're going to break down potential hunts that are available in these quests, as there are multiple IDs that would be considered viable for items. I don't know if there's a true best in some scenarios. So take everything that we're about to talk about with a grain of salt. And of course, it will always have a bias from my side, since there are items that I'm always looking for a little different. So you can view this more as a stream list rather than a specific list. But for people that are hopping into Ultimate and are looking for a place to start, that may or may not have a mix of PSO experience, hopefully this guide will give you the information that you need in order to make the right decisions for your characters and who you may bring, including IDs you may bring in order to run them. So, we're going to start with a doozy of a quest. Alphabetically speaking, in episode 1, we have August Atrocity number 1. Now, this quest is what I consider a 7-star difficulty. So, what do I mean by that? So, from the standpoint of a 7-star difficulty, it's on a 1 to 8 scale, 8 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. This is not a quest I would recommend for first-time players. There are a lot of enemies that are literally endgame mini-bosses, jam-packed, start to finish, all the way through the quest. Even though there are some healing circles in order to give you additional traps, since the idea behind it is that these quests are meant more for veteran players who are comfortable with a combination of casts, rangers, and a force to buff debuff. This is not a quest that I would recommend going into blindly, like a public lobby kind of setting. This is more intended for people that are properly geared. But because of the way that it's constructed, it also makes it a little harder to talk about what specifically is the top 3 IDs that I would recommend to you if you were to play this in order to go towards the milestone. So as part of 2025, there is a current gimmick where instead of adding 4 points to the lowest quest, it's going to add 8, basically doubling the number of clears based off the number of players. Again, that may work differently in different anniversaries, but enemy counts. There are a lot of Sinnohs. I'm telling you, there are a lot of machine-type monsters. There are a lot of dark-type monsters. So just looking at the top 10 in the major enemies category of what will you expect to see the most of in this quest, it is by far and large a ton of machine. So if you're looking for things that would potentially help the run a little bit, I would definitely be bringing Machine Dark into this quest, as it covers a large majority of the enemies. Welcome, DevG. Hope you're doing well. So, why is this quest difficult? Well, as I said before, there's a ton of mini-bosses. So we're going to briefly show you the ridiculous quest list. Again, the exact numbers aren't super important right now. Just be aware that the enemies in here are from all episodes, so even though it is labeled as an episode 1 quest, you will be fighting enemies such as Epsilon from episode 2, which is the tower area, one of the harder areas of the game. You have Goron detonators from episode 4, etc. So overall, this quest introduces a whole mix of enemy types that are very difficult to deal with for undergeared players. Proceed with your own... proceed with caution. Be aware that you're stepping into what I would consider one of the harder quests of the game. But there are some payoffs. Based off of the top 10 enemies, roughly speaking, I personally have been favoring Redria. Now, unfortunately, the first, 50 or so of the top 10 enemies don't give, the most in terms of value. You have Heart of Sorcerer Arcane, which is more kind of an accessory kind of thing. But I feel like they kind of pick up the pace if we take a look at the list overall. So things like Morphos, aka the fidget spinners that shoot lasers at you, give Yuncheng and things like that. So I gave a kind of extended list specifically for Redria, because I feel like this is an example of an ID that takes a mix of the major enemies and some of the lesser enemies, and gives you a whole bunch of value with no particular focus. Welcome, Grenada. So I would also recommend potentially IDs that can benefit from the high Cannabin counts and Sinnoh Gold counts, or Sinnoh Blues. Actually, I think it would be Sinnoh Red, excuse me, I'm using the old name, in order to kind of proceed and clear through. So Yellow Baw's pretty infamously good at mines. Purple, Aran, all really solid mines IDs. Blue ID could situationally be useful. But again, offhand, I personally prefer Redria, but again, we'll consider that bias going into it. So one thing that I would recommend, and we'll talk briefly about the tags are mostly self-evident. We're not going to talk about it in a huge amount of detail. If I write something like Demon or I write something like Freeze, I'm talking about there are a lot of ways you can basically apply demons to enemies. I would recommend checking out the link that will be included in the description if you want a larger breakdown on each of these subcategories. But basically be aware that there are options to single target as well as multi-target demons. When we're talking about something in the 7-star difficulty range, this is an assumption that you have things like S-rank weapons, like demon mech guns, that your freeze is not necessarily from weapons. It helps to have a frozen shooter, but it's going to be a huge reliance on things like freeze traps. So just be aware, if you see those things, that's what I'm talking about with some of the gear tags there. So let's move away from one of the hardest quests in the game to probably one of the easier quests. I would say if it wasn't for the sheer raw amount of Hildebears, which I will double check the count of right now in this particular quest, that this would have been more or less just a 1-star difficulty. So people that are first coming into Ultimate may struggle a little tiny bit, but that's kind of common for people that are coming in as a fresh character into this quest. Otherwise, for anybody that's in, upwards of 120, 140, they're pretty much going to steamroll this quest. And I want to draw attention to the fact that for recommendations for classes, well, Hunters tend to do very well with dealing with a whole bunch of mini-bosses and smaller waves, and Rangers could deal well with picking out large groups of enemies. I feel like if you are in easier areas, if you want to have a faster clear, you will generally prefer either a combination of Force or Ranger in any particular area. This is not to say that you can't play Hunter in Forest, you could do okay at it. It's just that if you're considering from the standpoint a Ranger that may or may not have endgame weapons like a Baran's launcher, which does a whole bunch of damage with charge hits, that it is very difficult to match the same clear speed as somebody that is just moderately geared, we'll put in air quotes, as any of these classes. So Forces in particular can kind of roll over almost every single wave here, in particular in single player where resistances and HP are lower. So if you're looking to kind of come in as a first-time player, you will have a much easier time, in particular getting an item called the Frozen Shooter as part of your hunts here. So just be aware from the standpoint that when you run this quest, it is generally run in order to find these large enemies. Now, in order to get the Frozen Shooter, aka a sniper that will freeze as a heavy accuracy weapon with 100% chance, as long as you hit, it will freeze versus going off of their special resistance. Any ID that can get you a Frozen Shooter is generally preferred. I picked 3 based off of just general enemy counts of additional items you would get in terms of, we'll say, supported pieces or extra value as you play the game. I will note that there are people that will be running a lot of blue ID for Heaven Punisher instead of Frozen Shooter. Now, I want to talk about this very briefly. I'm just going to label it as not recommended for the reason being that there are harder hunts that give a better drop rate than these enemies. If you are truly early game and you're saying, like, I need a Heaven Punisher to play the game, I'm telling you right now, if you're able to farm this item easily, you will probably be better off and faster at just farming the other options. So it is technically an option people play. I want people to be aware of it, that people play it, but unless the boosts are really, really ridiculously weighted towards rare enemy, it is really, really, really difficult to get in there. So I'll just briefly open up as an example. If we go into something like... We'll do Heaven Punisher as an example. Remote battery says purple CCA, way better, exactly. I just want to talk about it. I'll put it on screen briefly. So it will generally be better than a lot of the other options. Like you could see Sinnozel is 1 in almost 300,000, which is not ideal. Delbeater, pretty similar in terms of drop rate, but unfortunately this enemy is rather hard to hunt. Not that people don't do that, it's just that you'll see in my recommendations later on, just to point out, there's usually something that is like legitimately 10 times more likely to give you the drop. So just be aware that when I say it's not recommended, this is the reason I'm talking about. It can technically be done with some of these other enemies, but usually due to a combination of low enemy count or difficulty of quest, it might cause an issue. But anyway, let's proceed further. So I don't think you need any particular gear to do Forest. Forest is Forest, you mostly just need damage. So 2-star difficulty, when I'm talking about that, what differentiates it between, a 7-star and some of the other ones? 1-star is you could literally just show up, not even buff, and probably clear the quest. This quest, I would say, is a little tougher just because there are quite a few mini-bosses. So if you're playing with just basic Shifta, it's usually good enough to do it. If you happen to have crowd control items that give paralysis from S ranks, or things like Frozen Shooter, or a lot of freeze traps, those also greatly lower the difficulty of the quest, and by themselves are usually good enough. So a whole bunch of low-level hunters and or rangers trying to go forward with Ramar's level 15 buff probably can clear Forest without any major issue, and that's why I would put it in kind of a 2-star difficulty. So, from that perspective, kind of roughly in the same difficulty. I'd almost want to give it like a 2.2 star. It's technically slightly harder, but also it's easier in certain ways, which is kind of ironic. If you bring in enough EDK or Dark Resistance into the quest, I actually find it easier than Forest. I would recommend, for example, dealing with the Hilda Tours, you bring in things like Cure Shocks if you don't have a team that is capable of locking down all the enemies quickly. If you don't know what I'm talking about with EDK, I will briefly scroll back to my description here. So there are certain breakdowns depending on where you are hunting, where you are basically completely immune to enemies. So while you might have to worry about paralysis as a human or a Newman, or dodge the instant kill strike coming from the different variants of lilies in different areas, there is a magic number where if you hit it, it stops mattering. So if you want, you could pause the video here for a moment, take a look at some of the items recommended in order to get some of the EDK, in addition to the standard 15 dark resistances that can be applied here, like the Resist Devils, for example. It's not a hard number to hit. You'll be kind of surprised. Most gear will hit this. If you're not sure why you're not hitting it, I would definitely check out your armor type. In fact, some armors make you completely immune to everything, as long as you stack that with something like a Resist Devil, and it kind of trivializes all of those hunts. If you're wondering why sometimes things are listed on kind of a similar difficulty, the reason being is that it would technically be harder, but there are more levers and options to completely neutralize the challenge. So if you're coming in as, for example, as a cast into this quest with a dress plate that gives 70 EDK, you ignore one entire enemy type and you can't be paralyzed. So those particular characters have a pretty easy time in multiplayer, and to some extent single player as well. You'll see a lot of Ramars kind of soloing this area. You'll see forces kind of trivialize a lot of the lily spawns, where normally something like 8 lilies in a wide room would normally spell disaster for low-level parties, but you'll sit there with something like 3 seals, which gives 33 EDK, along with a couple other options, and just kind of laugh as the room can't do anything to you whatsoever, even when a middle lily spawns with its higher Megid EDK requirements to resist it. So be aware that it is a very good quest to get advice if you're looking for more of a self-found style quest. this would be a slightly easier alternative than doing this in a place like Mines, for example. People tend to run this for Psycho Wand. Again, I don't recommend it. There are other places to get Psycho Wand, but if you want to just go along for the ride and just say, hey, I want to pick up a couple of vices and maybe a Psycho Wand will happen, I won't fault you for it. do what you must in terms of items. But otherwise, it's kind of hard to say with the counts the way they are. I'll just briefly show. We'll move chat just for a second. Where there are like a lot of lilies, there are a lot of sharks. There's not a lot of grass assassins, which is a bit unfortunate, because there are some good drops from grass assassins that I think are kind of overlooked. And even though it says like there's 4 slimes in the quest, you can duplicate them if you really want to. Ultimately, I find if you need to slime dupe for something, or you need to rely on Crimson Assassin, your rares are a bit weaker. Overall, I would probably not super recommend this quest. The only reason it's even in this list is to talk about why people might run it. Personally, I would say kind of stay away unless you're looking for something very specific from caves, like a, I don't know, like a Gurren, a Shuren, or a V101. Again, I think there's some better options for them, but just be aware that these are the reasons people run it. But I could almost guarantee you like 90% of the caves runs are going to be purple, since people are going for the Dream Psycho 1 drop. So let's talk about kind of a more straightforward one. So talking about Vice chances yet again. Oops, I copied this note from something else. We can ignore that. That is not applicable to this quest. So this one is a little different than the previous one. There's nothing to really worry about in Mines in terms of instant kill. So as long as you bring in freeze traps and frozen shooter, you're probably good. There are a lot of enemies that fly up in the air, which make it kind of a nightmare to play as a hunter here in particular. So it's not even just the fact that there are a lot of enemies in a wave, which are already hard for hunters to deal with, but there's a lot of unfavorable types. Now, that doesn't mean you're useless in the quest as a hunter. There's a lot of Varans that spawn that you could potentially burst down as a player. So again, don't take that as you can't play as them, but you're going to find, unless you are truly on the more optimal side of gear, like we're talking about Dark Flow swings and pretty much endgame slicers and stuff like that, that you're going to have a lot of trouble clearing compared to just a very average character of the other 2 classes. Be aware that Barans are a lot more difficult in multiplayer for forces to clear than multiplayer. So while they can basically just Foey everything out of existence in single player, that's not really an option in multiplayer due to the HP and resistance features. So why would people kind of run this quest? Well, probably the number one reason is there's a lot of Cannadines. Cannadines give you a lot of vices. So again, comparing just between these two, 46 chances of getting a vice from something like Caves versus 65. Cannadines also die much faster than Lily comparatively. If your character is more comfortable with clearing the higher difficulty enemies, you'll generally prefer to kind of clear stuff like mines instead. So just be aware that there are different options to farm the same item. It just depends on how geared you are, how successful it is. So I would rate this more of a 3-star in terms of difficulty, just from the standpoint that there are much more damaging mini-bosses here than what you've seen in Forest and Caves up until this point. So things like Barans, for example, might require you to use demons as a force in order to kind of deal with them in multiplayer, where it requires a lot of frozen shooters to potentially lock down a bunch of Sinnohs, which are enemies that are notoriously basically super armoring through all your hits and don't follow the normal hit stun rules, which can really throw you off as you come into ultimate. And generally speaking, if you don't have enough damage, you are probably in trouble. So you might be able to get away with kind of like the raw model range of buffs and debuffs in order to carry kind of a beginner team. But if you just put a whole bunch of hunters together, for example, or just like a whole bunch of raw Mars without any other casts or force support, you're probably going to get run over at some point in this quest, which is why I rate this a bit higher than some of the other quests that we've talked about. So otherwise, Mines is pretty infamous for basically just going in and getting Lame to Argent or Excalibur drops and V101s. There's not a lot of Well, there's an okay amount. I'm gonna say not a lot. Let me just move this. There are 42 guild chicks, so things like RNID are also okay. So I'll just make a note here that if you really want to kind of do that kind of stuff, that RN is okay. I'll just put alternatives here, where if you want to, it's decent. But generally speaking, if you aren't getting a Lame to Argent, or at least a V101, there's usually not a whole reason, a big reason to play it outside of purple. So mine's is a bit more linear, I would say, in terms of both the things that you could clear and options that you have in terms of good drops there. So we'll move on in terms of difficulty. So coming to the end of episode 1, we have the MAE Ruins. Now this one I think is actually somewhat good to clear as a hunter, because there are smaller waves comparatively. They don't tend to flood you with like 20 plus enemies. That isn't to say that there aren't some annoying waves. Anytime you have to deal with claws, I would recommend just playing solo Force or Ranger in that scenario. But I think Hunter starts to have a little bit of value here compared to some of the other episode clears, just because the HP totals of things like Anti-Belras and Chaos Bringers, and even potentially the Dark Gunners, are a little too high for some of the other classes to one combo without truly endgame items. So you'll see the Hunter value actually start to go up in the harder areas of the game. Now, I would recommend, in order to deal with these different enemy types, that you have at least one cast, and you potentially supplement that with freeze, or you supplement that with paralysis. So 4-star difficulty, the way I kind of view these things is that if you don't have a minimum level of buffs, your 900 ATP, your 1000 ATP character is just not going to do enough damage to kill basically anything in the quest. There's going to be a lot of enemies with potentially very high defense. Unless you're supplementing that with like 400 plus attack power weapons, certain characters just can't even damage enemies at that level without a buff in multiplayer. So just be aware that there is a higher expectation needed in order to even get your foot in the door for damage. And I would always recommend that if you find that you're on the lower end of ATP, and you happen to be like a character like a Ranger, you have options to kind of supplement that with demons. Demons would be my recommendation to clear some of the mini bosses, which is why I put a little footnote here. So things like Darkbringers, when they have 4,000 something health, and you're playing a, maybe 900, 950 character, kind of on the up and up in the level 120, 140 region, depending on your character, you'll probably kill faster with demons than you will trying to ATP them down. Between needing so many debuffs and so many buffs just to do okay damage, this is where some experimentation really comes in. It really, really, really depends how good your gear is, whether demons would be faster for you. But I would recommend that you have at least one player with a higher grade weapon, so that everybody's not playing with fresh weapons. So while I think you could get away with a lot of players not being fully set up, as in, they might have like a kind of, very hard mode option for clears and AoE, or they kind of have for forces, they have lower end spells. Maybe they're using like level 21s instead of level 29s for clears. You could get away with that pretty easily in the lower star difficulties, but around the 4 to 5 star difficulty, in my opinion, this is where you need at least one player that can kind of carry you. So if you don't have a player that is really pumping out the damage, I would not recommend hopping into a quest like the Ruins quest. There are a lot of enemies that potentially can roll over you, between the Darkbringers knocking you down and punishing you full screen with a high damaging laser if you hit them multiple times but don't kill them, or the multitude of sorcerers where forces can't really kill them easily unless they have access to demons and stuff like that, or a very high ATP weapon like an Excalibur, or Rangers are using stuff to supplement their damage, again, high-end Brand's launcher, but kind of in between that might be something like a Daylight Scar, or even stuff like Galatines might be examples. You might see Rangers and Hunters use to just take out a single target. Charge Vulcans and Berserk variants of those kinds of things might not work for those players at lower levels. So just be aware that this is a harder quest, but mostly just from a stat perspective. I don't think there's anything too crazy in terms of spawn patterns that will alienate new players. Just be aware that from the perspective of hunts, Ruins is kind of on the end of items. So this is something that people would just kind of clear for very specific things. Usually it's something like Spread Needle. I will note that there is one other item that can only be gotten here in the... Actually, let me separate it out separately. So we'll say Farm Sorcerer for sake of clarity here, where there is an item called Handgun Gold, where essentially it is one of the only options to get this item. So if we take a look at the... We can see there's only 3 drops of this in the entire game, and one of them is the Episode 1 Sorcerer. So just be aware that people will hunt it because it's an option. I personally will not recommend that you go for this. I'm gonna say not recommend. Well, I'm gonna put an asterisk. I'll put an asterisk for now. So it's one of those things where you are hunting it for the sake of hunting it. It is something that an endgame player would go for. Does it advance your ability to clear the higher difficulty quests? No. Should you hunt this as a new player? No. Should you hunt this when you're kind of done with the game and you already have your loadout? Sure, why not? That's about where this particular item is. It doesn't have like a super purpose so far, in so that it will not really speed up any of your clears. More of a kind of show-off item. So make note that people do run it. You know what? I'll just put out correct. We'll say despite good drop rate. I think that's kind of the best way to clarify that. So I think that clears up all of episode 1's. So we're gonna move to an arguably about on par difficulty. I'm not really sure if I would rate this one higher or not than August Atrocity 1. Both of these quests have enemies across different episodes. This one is technically easier, I would say, if you have access to Hell. So when I'm talking about things like Hell, what I mean by that is if we take an item and wear a unit called V502, typically speaking, if you're going to do this quest, you could boost the chance of insta-kill working on challenge mode weapons or the ES weapons. So a lot of these enemies can be just absolutely bulldozed by Hell weapons. So instead of dealing with enemies with potentially 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 HP in Ultimate, you can just do a normal special and kill them. So there is a very big difference in clear compared to August Atrocity 1 and 2. I think this quest is, slightly harder if you don't have Hell. It takes so much longer since every enemy is so much tankier. But if you have Hell, it does speed up the run exponentially. And kind of by that same extension, due to the fact that there are so many mini-bosses throughout this quest, Hunters are still going to do pretty well here. Most of the time, waves are in the somewhat reasonable 3 to 5 range. I would say the lower you have of a number below 4, the more it weighs in the favor of a Hunter. And there are just kind of standalone mini-bosses you could deal with as a Hunter. I feel like this is one of their times to shine. You might see teams like Double Huecast, Rawcast, and Force, for example, just kind of steamrolling this quest, and occasionally just having a Ranger figure out some of the easier enemies like the Gibbons with some of your AoE hell shots. Now granted, not every enemy can be held that is on this major enemies list, but it does speed it up very significantly to have it. So with that out of the way, I feel like this one is a bit less controversial in terms of who has the best overall drop. We take a look at almost every single one of these drops. White ID is kind of the best ID all the way through. Actually, it doesn't get Frozen Trigger here, I lied to you. And that's due to the fact that White ID gets something from almost every single one of these enemies, due to the fact that White ID is just really good with Temple, and it is really, really, really good with CCA. And because there are so many gibbons and there are so many geese, the gibbons and the gee counts combined mean you have over, I think, 58 chances just from those 3 enemy types, which comprise of more than a third of the quest. So a third of the quest is already one of the best discas in the game, and then everything else is probably an Uber or something of value from you, or for you, like, for example, the Rag Rappies and things like that. So kind of an easy pick here, to be honest with you. But I do think Pink ID is probably the only other candidate that benefits along the same lines. The only difference is that it gives up some of the White ID Ubers. So for people that are more interested in Uber items, I think White ID does a little better than Pink here. But if you're just looking for a generically strong beat stick while also still benefiting from some of those Disco Brainman chances and some of those really easy to acquire temple items, can't go wrong with Pink ID here either. So it really just depends on where you are in the game and which enemy set you see working out for you. So I feel like, as I said before, this one is a bit more straightforward, a bit easier to call. Not super complicated stuff here. Now, moving away from another 7-star difficulty, we're going to go back down in difficulty. I feel Temple is kind of on the precipice where if you're able to do caves, you're probably able to do Temple in episode 2. That's about where I would rate it in terms of difficulty. This one, if you don't have all the gear tags, potentially will end up being harder than some of the episode 1 counterparts. So I would recommend bringing in EDK in order to deal with, again, Lilies and Temple. Hell makes this potentially way easier than the episode 1 counterparts. And if you don't have a cast with you, anybody that has any options for freeze, whether it's frozen shooter or, optional weapons that have the same effect, or paralysis, both of them work really well here. So you have a lot of endgame weapons that potentially trivialize this area. So depending on your gear type, this may or may not be more difficult than caves, but to endgame players, generally speaking, this area is pretty free. So most of the time, the only reason you would run something like this are the classic tried and true temple IDs. It's always going to be white ID. It's always going to be pink ID. I don't think there's any reason to run any other ID. We could take a look at temple just to show you how pointless some of the other IDs there are in this area. So when we're talking about things like Rappy drops, Vivian versus Rambling May are both very good, for example, and pink versus white. Mill Lily, again, another rare enemy thing, gives Rambling May here, or 13, which is a fantastic armor. Or if you happen to not get the rare drop, then you get Disco Braveman chances, aka one of the best drops in the game in terms of discos. So it's not even really close with the other IDs. Like, am I really gonna get more evasive power instead of an endgame armor? Do you know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't make sense. So there's not really a reason to run any other ID. They tried a little bit with red ID. I guess you could try to make some argument that if you're really desperate, Rambling May can be about the same as white ID, and technically it gets one more Disca chance in Mothfort, but you're giving up 13 and Lily, which are more common enemy types and better enemy rares. So for me, I don't see a reason to run it, honestly, outside of pink or white ID. In fact, I'm willing to bump up pink ID a little higher up on this list than white ID for this particular quest, just due to the number of Rappies, in addition to the Mill Lilies. So kind of on the same difficulty span, this is a slightly harder version of Mines, but again, depending on your gear requirements, it ends up potentially being easier than Mines. So without Hell, I would say this quest would be more akin to Ruins in terms of ATP clear. However, most people just never bother ever doing damage outside of the Barans in this area. So if you have an S-rank Hell option with V502 boosting your chances, you are literally just normal specialing every wave, every room, and occasionally you are inconvenienced and have to pull out a Charge Vulcan once, maybe twice, before the end of the quest. And from that perspective, it becomes very easy. However, if you don't have a full army of Hell users, or you have kind of a, I would say, mixed we'll say boosts to hell. So you might not have V502s, or you only have a V501, or you don't have some of those S ranks. You could kind of substitute it to an extent with freeze or paralysis, but be aware that Barans or any machine enemy in general cannot be paralyzed. So you still need at least one single target freeze in order to deal with Barans. Now, the only reason that people run Spaceship, to be honest with you, Daylight Scar. You could technically get Handgun Gold here. I'm going to put this into the not recommended category. You could technically do it. It's not very fun. I'm going to be honest with you. It's just very mediocre. But from the standpoint of items, there's only really two things that stand out at all in Spaceship. And again, if you're at the point where you have Hell and all these other things, generally you wouldn't be hunting for Gurren or Daylight Scar. I always found that kind of confusing in the PSO drop tables, that these items help you with other quests, but if you can do this quest, then you could already do those other quests easier. So you wouldn't need these items anymore. I just find it kind of odd, chat. That's all I'm saying. Hashtag buff Spaceship. Just give Spaceship something other than Daylight Scar and Gurren and disappointing Handgun Gold. That's all I'm saying. So now we have kind of a drastic departure in difficulty. But let me scroll back up. So we're going to go from the temple to the spaceship to Central Control Area, or CCA. This area is genuinely hard. There are a lot of mini-bosses that do massive amounts of damage. You will probably get one-shot and killed if you're below 1,000 health. So I would super recommend, as we start approaching kind of the end difficulty of things, that you have max accuracy. There's going to be a lot of enemies that are actually extremely difficult to hit. If you're not already capped in ATA, it is the difference between having an 80% hit on a target and like 50%. So if you're 15 or 20% or 15 to 20 ATA under, suddenly you can't even normal heavy special. You might not even hit the first normal, and your second normal is iffy, and your third hit can only be a heavy. So your potential damage is completely neutered if you do not have max ATA for these kinds of quests. So I would recommend, in order to kind of clear this level of quest, that you have people with demons. You have people that have all the high-end gear, your strong weapons, like Excalibur, or some giant beatstick in order to clear it faster. You should be playing with casts for freeze traps. You should be potentially with one or two players that know some of the, we'll call them problem spawns, as Episode 2 in particular likes to throw enemies at you that could just end your run if you do not know that they are there. So I'll give an example. There are 3 types of insta-kill giant murder flowers. You have the Miracle, the Maracus, and the Maricarols. If any of those are not stun-locked by your team, if they are not frozen, if they are not shot, if they are not instantly deleted the moment that they appear, they will probably party wipe a group that is not ready to deal with them. So you cannot really kill them with techniques. You can stun them with techniques as kind of a, I'll say, fail-safe, another way to maybe survive 3 or 4 uncontrolled, unmanaged murder flowers. Maybe it'll work, but I highly recommend that the casts in particular familiarize themselves with certain waves in order to lock them down. So this is where, even more so than normal in PSO, that the hunter's positioning on mini-bosses is super, super crucial. This is what is the difference between you having a casual game and doing well versus a casual game. It goes on for 30 minutes, can't kill anything, everybody gets in a death loop. It's all about getting that initial lockdown. And because of that, I rate that a lot higher than something like Ruins. Whereas you can make a comeback in Episode 1 in regards to Darkbringers and things like that, CCA, in particular the maximum attack E here, is rather merciless. If you don't have Hell to quickly get rid of easy to kill enemies that actually don't have a ton of health, they end up body blocking priority targets. So suddenly this giant murder flower that can kill your party instantly from basically anywhere in the room will have a wall of plants that block the shots. So if you do not kill that miracle instantly, if you do not freeze trap it, if you do not Hell through the targets so you can land your shots with your other characters, you're in big trouble. So for that reason, I do not recommend this for newer players, but that isn't to say it isn't a lot of fun. So if you have the gear capacity, you have a lot of ATP, you're on the high end of accuracy, your reward are actually pretty decent drop rate of Ubers. So you kind of have two major enemy types that you would farm CCA for. You'll see people farm it for... I almost want to flip these. Technically, Gibbles is a lot easier to farm here than some of the other places. So if you want a Psycho Wand, just play Orange ID. You want to get Lavas Cannons while also getting things like Disca of Brave Man, you'll play something like White Ol or Yellow Boss. If you want to get a Heaven Punisher, if you want to get a Gatling Gun, if you want an alternative to get V502, because you want to get Hell in order to make these runs easier for your other characters, pick the respective ID. I don't think there's one that is quote-unquote the best here, because it really just depends on what you need, and prices fluctuate all the time. I will say, though, that this is probably one of the better runs you could do for Heaven Punisher, and you'll see that a lot on our streams, especially if you go back through the VODs. Aside from that, we're almost done with episode 2. I like that these are basically hand in hand. These are the absolute red flag danger zone. Please do not play these quests if you are not feeling very confident with your gear level and character skills. Seabed and Tower will chew you up and spit you out. These are enemies that will no mercy set damage you for like 1,000. Between Del Beaters, which run you over and kill you, basically if you're under level 120, it's just one of the hardest stat checks in the game. And then you have the actual hardest stat check in the game of Tower, where you have Epsilon shooting out Refoes for potentially 1,600 plus damage, unless you have a perfect balance of HP and fire resistance. So just be aware, these are not ones that you could take your casual, fresh level 80 character that is looking to assist other people. You will more likely than not just die instantly to anything hitting you, set damage wise, or just regular damage, because Sinnohs in Seabed area in particular do a ton of damage. Gibbles in Tower does a ton of damage and is backed up by a lot of other awful enemies from Seabed. So with that in mind, these are probably on the higher end. Whether or not you want to rate them above or over an August Atrocity, I would say is more of a matter of opinion. None of them I would recommend doing without freeze. I would say demons may or may not be necessary in Seabed, but it is 100% necessary in Tower to deal with Epsilon, who is a notoriously high defense to the point where you cannot physically damage him in multiplayer with most characters without a buff and or debuff on the enemy. You will literally do 0 damage. If you have like 1,000 ATP and you're trying to hit with daggers, teehee, that's not doing anything. You're going to be there forever. You're never going to win. I don't mean you're doing single damage. I mean you're doing actually 0. It's over. The run is over. So just be aware that Seabed, I would say, is probably the other way. You could go for Heaven Punisher or Psycho Wand. So you'll see people do it for Del Beaters. Sadly, because of how bad the quest distribution is, it is one of the easier areas to get Sinnozoas in, which to this day just feels really wrong and shows how bad enemy count distribution is. But we'll save that conversation for a larger video. Trust me, we will have a long rant about how bad the enemy counts are in episode 2 in the future. But just be aware that 17 is considered a high number for some reason in the same video where we're talking about 40 plus of a particular enemy. So take that as you will in terms of your hunt potential. Now, because these areas are very difficult, on top of them having a lot of health, most of them are more or less immune to techniques. So if you're using a force in episode 2, I am so sorry. You are basically more or less forced to play demons and or ATP if you want to survive. And obviously, if you have to do demons or ATP to survive, why not just play Ramarl? Why not just play Hunoworld? I'm just saying, chat, like at that point, if you're trying to like solo it or play with a smaller group, you might as well do that. Just be warned, these are all kind of endgame hunts. These are not things I would kind of casually come into unless people are really willing to kind of walk you through and kind of teach you the quest. These kinds of 7-star difficulty ones are full of potentially really punishing enemy types. Delbeater, for example, is an enemy that just immediately slides on screen and smacks into you. You'll see that behavior in August Atrocity as well with Dorphons, and also August Atrocity has Delbeaters, by the way. But from that standpoint, not super friendly. However, if you're looking for Ubers there's kind of not really a better place for a majority of them. So if you want to do a white ID run for V502 and you want to go for Handgun Gold and you want to get Psycho 1 and you want to get Lava's Cannon, it's kind of the all expenses paid package for Ubers and useful units. But I would only attempt this towards the end of your, I would say, PSO characters power level, as it is not a very beginner-friendly series of quests, Seabed or Tower. So just be aware from that standpoint. Seabed can be a little more merciful from Tower from the standpoint that the golems or the squid creatures, as well as Morphos, can be held out of existence. If you don't have Hell, I would argue that it's almost harder than Tower in some places. But again, this is why we make those recommendations to bring those required items. So if you don't have AoE Hell, I would probably stay away from Seabed. And if you don't have freeze traps, I would probably not run Seabed or Tower. So finally, chat, there is no August Atrocity for episode 4. So we only have 2 quests to cover both of these. And we have Crater and Desert. Now, the enemies are shared more or less between both areas in terms of things like satellite lizards and zoos. So there's a kind of crossover between the enemy types you might see. The difference being that a lot of the Buddhas are replaced with Gorons and things like that. But they're similar to like the cave sharks or like the forest bears, essentially. It's just kind of your standard 3 enemies with 3 different elemental weaknesses, etc. They're not like very crazy different in terms of difficulty. Now, what makes this a little different in terms of clear speed and why these 2 quests are recommended for solo over some of the other ones that we discussed is something called the Heaven Striker plus Striker unit, or Heaven Punisher, potentially with a add-on called the, I want to say, Divine Filter. Now, if you happen to have this gun, so Heaven Striker is a drop that happens in episode 4, and you have a unit called the Striker unit, and it happens to be even beat, these quests are a total joke. They go from moderately challenging, like they'll have more HP than most things that you'll see in mines and ruins, to you just hit the special button over and over until everything in front of you is dead and there's nothing they can do about it. So in a weird way, these quests can end up being some of the easiest quests to play over some of the other options. So if you don't have, an S rank item to hell everything down, you might find yourself just playing as solo force and basically Gafoi stacking almost every single one of these quests, where the resistance to techs is so much lower in episode 4 compared to episode 2 in particular, but even episode 1 multiplayer, that you could pretty much just get some endgame gear to gear up your ranger here, and then just play with your ranger in the other areas, for example. So if you like to go for limiter, it's not a bad option to get it from Astarks in this quest from the Bluefull ID. Otherwise, you have some items that will potentially just finish off your hunters or your rangers. So for example, you could play Redria for Cannon Rouge, which is a great bazooka versus bosses. Or you might switch into something like Lame to Argent or Excalibur, which is great for forces and rangers and hunters when you're trying to get through the high defenses of episode 2, or even some of the mini bosses of episode 1 in Ruins, for example. So just be aware that the surface is generally not played as much, since those items are more of a kind of completing the character thing, whereas some of the best items in the game are actually just found in Desert. So once you're kind of comfortable with Crater and you're willing for those enemies to kind of level up, so I'll just very briefly touch upon the 5-star difficulty, since I think it's the first time we talked about it in the video, where I think you could get away with some very basic buffs in a 4-star run of Crater, where maybe you need to debuff the enemies if you don't have Pew Pew Laser in order to kill them faster. You will find that the enemies hit harder in general underground in the desert area compared to the Crater or the surface. So I would recommend having at least some combination of traps. I would recommend having high ATP. There's certain enemies called Girdabulu in the underground area that have very high defense, but are extremely susceptible to multi-target demons. So for example, if you have a Slicer Fanatic, you can hit the mini-boss 3 times every time you go to throw a special. So potentially using demons on it between 1 and 6 successful times in 2 throws due to it bouncing. And it can kind of trivialize the difficulty. And I'm talking about to the point where it might take you 50 seconds to kill it by just blasting it down with Vulcans or trying to hit it with high weapons, versus just normal, special, normal, dead. And that's the entire boss. So, or mini boss, I mean. So just be aware that there is a higher amount of damage to be had. It's a bit more punishing. There's enemy types in here that could kind of teleport around, which are the Gorons of the Underground, which are meant to be anti-ranger. But spoilers, the Divine Laser Blasts don't really trigger their anti-ranger defenses, so it kind of cheeses their entire gimmick. And be aware that there are enemies like the Zoo, which fly in the sky, which can be kind of annoying for Hunter. If you don't have a really solid control on Vulcans, you could get away with using Pistol, for example, to stop their dive bombs, but higher end play usually involves using Vulcans, which some players may not be comfortable with. And also be aware that there are two different types of lizards. I believe it is the Yowie and the Satellite Lizards that block projectiles from the front. There's a lot of kind of, we'll say, anti-ranger stuff in, because there's kind of a ranger supremacy, as you can see from all the times I've recommended in the other quests. But again, if you have something like the Heaven Punisher on on Even Beat, you could use the Divine Punishment Special, which is multiple lasers raining down from the heavens and basically stun locking every enemy in the room. And I mean basically every enemy. We're talking like it's going to hit 5+ targets a majority of the time. So you are just completely room clearing effortlessly, and it is not a very high resistant damage item. So generally speaking, the best way to get Heaven Striker is to probably trade for it first, and then you just farm for one with hit percentage or any enemy attribute percentage you're looking for. If you want to use its other special, the Berserk Shot down enemies, then you might farm something like this on green or red ID in order to basically get your complete package in terms of ranger gear, so you could do the hardest quests in the game. Or this is also a pretty good way to get Lame to Argent, so you'll see a lot of people running Skyly in it. It is one of the few times you could kind of shortcut directly to a Goron detonator. There's not many quests that don't have what we'll call a lot of filler, getting to enemies like Girdabulu and Goron detonator in episode 4 in general. So you'll see a lot of people farm these different types of items. Just be aware, if you're looking for general value, I think Pink ID is slightly better than the other options. But from the standpoint of believing in a dream, Heaven Striker payoffs and Lame to Argent are obviously a lot stronger for individual characters versus general sale value in trades. So, with that, I think we covered every single quest that is in the anniversary. So overall, I would say there are some that can be soloed fairly easily, some of them in the 2 to 4 star range. Generally speaking, anything that is 7 star in this event is only recommended to be run with at least 4 players. You could get away with running 3-man or 2-man teams and anything that is probably 4 star and below if you're a higher end character. If you have kind of mixed gear, like maybe somebody has, you know, like a level 160 character, but none of those crazy 600 plus ATB items, then you might be able to get away with a 3-man in things like Ruins without too much of an issue, just due to having raw stats. But be aware that Anniversary in general is a good mix of beginner-friendly quests and also pretty difficult quests. Hopefully that covers all the questions you might have in regards to running the Anniversary for 2025 and maybe some future years. If there are updates, we will post additional VOD/videos in regards to clearing those updated quests. But for now, I think this covers everything I wanted to talk about. So I always like to give chat a moment or two if they think I've missed something or think I've other than typos, I'll clean it up in the official links. If there's something that they feel is run that wasn't discussed in this video, I would say now is their opportunity to speak. But as always, I welcome, we'll say, positive comments. If you feel that there's something that could be added to in the guide, I am more than happy to update as needed. As I said before, that these quests are potentially changing even in the event themselves. So this is just my take as it is. And with that, I guess we're done with the quests. I will state in general that there are larger breakdowns for each of the gear tags, going into more detail about things you might need to bring into the quest. One thing we didn't talk about specifically, but just be aware, there generally aren't any traps in the Anniversary quests, which is kind of nice, since it can be kind of annoying to have things like Trap Vision or Lieutenant Mantle, or having a cast in your party to deal with all the traps. It's not really something you have to worry about. There aren't like suddenly like 1400 fire damage traps and caves waiting to annihilate you instantly. But be aware that you can always supplement your clear speed by just bringing in additional support things, whether it's freeze, paralysis, hell, or demon. Generally speaking, episode 2 will reward you more for hell than some of the other episodes, but be aware that paralysis and freeze are generally useful in every area, with the caveat that paralysis does not work on certain mini bosses and also does not work on machines. So with that, I think we've covered basically everything. Sadly, there aren't really, I would consider, super high XP quests or value quests in this group. I think they're all generally strong from the standpoint that they currently give badges and things in that nature, but they're still a little bit under in terms of XP compared to some of the other quests. So from that standpoint, you're probably fine if you're a new player going into forest or cave games and public games in order to just kind of get your feet wet, get used to the system. And I would recommend playing in public games so that way you can potentially get those items like Frozen Shooter in order to support teams in harder quests later down the line. Hello everybody, this is post-stream Ziggy here. So I had a conversation with the chat about some of the other sections that will be coming up in future guide videos. And I figured that this would actually be better to include at the end of our discussions on the anniversary event as just kind of an FYI to the newer players. So what I have on screen currently is a little section on the second player ID swapping. Long story short, essentially, if you have a player that can benefit from rare monsters, choose an ID that gives you a drop that you're looking for, whether it's in forest, caves, temple, crater, or desert. You could squeeze a little more out of any given run. So to give an example, normally in forest, we don't worry about this since most of the time that you're in forest, even in MAE, you're usually running a Frozen Shooter ID. It's not technically applicable there, but if for whatever reason you find yourselves in caves and you happen to come across a Mill Lily, if player 2, for example, is Purple Numb, which would give you a Psycho Wand, you can have player 1 drop out of the game, giving the other 3 players a chance at getting an extra rare item. So this is something you could do with clans or groups of friends to kind of just bring out a little extra value in any kind of run that you're doing. And just be aware from that standpoint that if you do happen to be playing something like Pink ID Temple during the event, usually you'll see people pair up with a Viridian player in the second player spot, since it basically turns all the value of a white ID run, or even technically a red ID run, into a Frozen Shooter run, without having a whole bunch of rares that you're not looking for. Similarly, you'll see Viridian used in Episode 4, whether it's for Pazuzu, for LNK Combat 38, or excuse me, LNK 38 Combat, or Dorphonic Claire giving you chances at Lame to Argent. Now, technically, there are kind of other secondary IDs you could play, like if you're just really desperate for Cannon Rouge. At the moment, Green Ale and Yellow Boss happen to both give those things. Or similarly, if you're in Desert, some IDs don't get access to things like Ophiel Seas, so if you have something like a Flamberge there instead, in theory you could sub out whoever is player 1, have them slash lobby out or quit game, and give the other 3 players a chance based off of player 2. I just wanted to kind of make a comment there that this is applicable to basically every quest that you run. I have gone back since the end of the particular stream, and I have updated some of the quest guides to kind of designate ones that are a little stronger than others with a little swap here. For example, technically from the standpoint of these quests, any quest that has a rare enemy potential is something you could swap out for. And generally speaking, I've tried to include in the latest version of the guide, instead of the word farm, the word swap, to give you an idea of what specific rares you could be going for. So hopefully this inspires you to kind of, I guess, get extra value out of runs with friends here. Typically speaking, as I said before, if you're playing something like Forest, you should already be playing a Frozen Shooter ID. Same thing with Caves. You're usually playing for Psycho Wand if you're in a common run versus what is technically value. So just keep that in mind. And with that, I think that is the official last thing that I have to say about the anniversary event. So if you have any additional suggestions, feel free to share positive advice or additional tags you think would help new players. Again, the content and intent of this guide is meant to kind of ease people into thinking about what IDs they could potentially run now, both as player 1 and player 2, with the intent being that I want to make sure that people that have never played the event before or haven't really bothered looking into the drop charts get a chance to get value while enjoying levels, whether it's on something in Forest, CCA, Crater, whatever. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you again for watching, and hope to see you again in the next guide.